Okay, Michelle. Thank you, Michelle. Hi, Managing Editor of American Purpose. And great to see so many friends and colleagues and allies. This is a pleasure to welcome you, and introduce today's conversation. It's an hour. It's a hard stop at 1 p.m. Eastern. Elliott Abrams, welcome. We have guests today who don't need an introduction, but must have some introduction by me. And I want to say thank you for your time in advance, Elliott. You have served at senior levels in the US government, in the White House, in the State Department. You're a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. I read you this morning in National Review. You're chair of the Tikva Fund. I hope I said that right. And maybe 6 other things. But we're looking forward to your comments and your conversation with Chuck Lane, who is also a good and dear friend, Charles Lane. Chuck Lane is an editorial writer at the Washington Post. He's a columnist at the Washington Post. He's a member of the editorial board at the Washington Post, and he's a book author. He's a former editor of the New Republic, and I think one of the most interesting public intellectuals in this space today. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to all of you and the tremendous expertise in this gallery today. Good heavens. Chuck, we're looking forward. It's over to you. Lead the conversation.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That's a very kind introduction. And my prompt to say, just for the record, I'm delighted to be here in my personal capacity, not speaking on behalf of the Post or its editorial board. I'm looking around the virtual room here and seeing a lot of familiar faces, and that's wonderful. The topic for Elliott's conversation with us today is democracy promotion, and he's certainly been in the thick of that throughout his career. What I had hoped to do as the moderator here is to facilitate a good exchange on that, starting with some remarks by Elliott that may take say the first 10 minutes or so. I'll ask a couple of questions, we'll have an exchange, and then we'll throw the meeting open probably around 12:30 to your comments and questions. I will be the person who kind of calls on you. I think you can kind of raise your hand. There's that little thing you click on in a Zoom meeting. By now, everybody knows about it. And so without further ado, I am going to go mute myself and introduce and listen to Elliott Abrams. Elliott, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks. Thank you for inviting me today. It is great to see so many familiar names and faces, but also great to see unfamiliar ones. What I wanted to talk about was, in essence, why we failed in Venezuela. Venezuela is a very interesting case of democracy promotion, bipartisan democracy promotion by the United States that failed. And I think that as we look at the lessons of why it failed, they're immediately applicable to other places. They are not idiosyncratic to Venezuela. There are probably 20 reasons you could come up with, but let me mention 6 or 8. And then we can talk about those. First, I was very struck by the degree to which the regime in Venezuela was able to survive, even though it was in many ways weak and extremely unpopular, because it had outside support. The contrast I would draw is with the right-wing military dictatorships in Latin America that the Reagan administration helped get rid of in the 80s. They didn't have outside support. So the only kind of ideological and real support they had was in the US. So when Reagan turned against them, they fell, not overnight, but over a decade. The democratic forces were able to win. But the Maduro regime had Russia, China, Cuba, Iran, And that has meant a great deal. Intelligence assistance, military assistance, financial assistance, diplomatic support in the UN, for example. So that's first. This question of outside support, I think, is critical and can allow even a weak and unpopular regime to survive. Second, economic sanctions. And again, this obviously has very broad implications. We have very heavy economic sanctions on Venezuela. They have not been changed really from Trump to Biden, yet they have not moved the regime. And I think we can say why, despite the impact on Venezuela's exports. And the answer is that they don't affect the ruling elite. That is, the sanctions that have said things like you can't export oil don't affect the finances of the ruling elite, which still has mansions and wives and mistresses and children and bank accounts all over Europe, for example. And actually, to some extent, Miami, but mostly in Europe at this point. So this is a question about targeting of sanctions. And broad economic sanctions that don't affect those elites are unlikely to change their views. Third, I would say there's, how to put this, people have to see that things are going to get better if there is political change. That is, the population at large must see that it will benefit from the change. In Venezuela, people did not blame US sanctions for their poverty, for the terrible humanitarian situation. But that did not mean that they believed that if the opposition took power, they themselves would be better off. So this is a failure on the part of the United States and other democracies supporting Guaido and the Democratic opposition. We actually had in the State and Treasury Department some pretty detailed economic plans that would have given cash to every Venezuelan family to jumpstart the economy until such time as they could get, World Bank and IMF loans under a new government. We never went public with those, which I think in retrospect was a real mistake. They were never publicized. They were never finalized. Fourth, regime leaders need to see a way out. When I was in the Reagan administration, we were able to say to baby Doc Duvalier, and I guess it was 86, early 86, I think, go, just go. And we said the same thing in a sense to Marcos. Partly because there's an international criminal court now. It's harder to do that now. But obviously, if the only thing that's facing Maduro and let's say 50 closest people to him or 20 closest is prison for life, they're going to hold on very tight. In the Reagan comparison, we were able to say to the generals that there is going to be an amnesty, and there was an amnesty. We said that in the case of Venezuela. I mean, I said it, others said it. There's always an amnesty. Eastern Europe, South Africa, all of Latin America's cases. But again, there's now an international criminal court, and in Argentina, Chile, a couple of other places, 10 or 20 years later, the Supreme Court undoes the amnesty. This is a big problem. These amnesties do not bring justice, because the people who are punished certainly deserve punishment, but they make the transition a lot harder if regime leaders see nothing ahead but prison when they leave power. I'd say the same thing, and let's call this fifth, about the generals, military leaders, generals and colonels. They've got to see some kind of future for themselves and the institution as well. And we in the opposition never were able to persuade them that post-Maduro, this would happen. I mean, we said it, I said it, I can show you the speech, but, and it was a good speech about how Venezuela had real national security threats and needed an army, needed a better army, a modern army, and so forth. But they didn't believe it. And this raises a separate question, but I'll put it in here. One of the things the United States did not do with respect to the military in Venezuela was intervene. That is, for example, at no point was the CIA instructed to contact Venezuelan military leaders or retired Venezuelan military and try to make deals to get rid of the Maduro regime. This is not happening as well, for example, in Nicaragua, as far as I know. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily know, but I'd be pretty sure it's not happening. And I'm reminded of a couple of sentences in Shirley Christian's book on Nicaragua, which is, 40 years old. The Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America, Pete Vakey, I'm reading now, felt that we could and should force out Somoza in the fall of '78. And then you have Bob Pastor, who is the NSC Latin America guy, saying, quote, "I felt that we couldn't and shouldn't. Because, says Pastor, we would have to answer the question, are you trying to overthrow this man? I felt, says Pastor, I felt that Carter should not overthrow a government. I felt that we were in the business too long and it was time to get out of that business, regardless of what the circumstances were." Well, fine. And that's how the Sandinistas came to power. I would make an argument this was the same thing about Batista. We didn't try to create the next government. We didn't in Nicaragua in the 80s. That was 79, sorry. And we didn't in Venezuela under Trump. And in retrospect, an extremely difficult thing to do. And one could argue that we would have failed in it or would have botched it. But it's something to think about. When you see the intervention on the part of Cuba, for example, in Venezuela, why can't we do more? I'll just take a couple of minutes for a few more points. One of the things that we didn't do in Venezuela that's so important was to protect the opposition leaders. Many of them went to jail, were tortured, were killed in some cases. In an odd way, one could argue that we are doing a better job in Cuba today than in Venezuela, because obviously people go to prison, but in the last few years, international pressure has given some protection in Cuba. And I think it's fair to say that we were able to protect Guaido. We meaning, the 40 countries that were backing him. But we weren't really able to protect the opposition any more than we've been able, you could say, in Iran. So I guess that was 6. 2 more points, and then I'll stop. Negotiations. What do we do about negotiations? My view is if the opposition wants to negotiate, we back them, even if we're privately dubious about it. In the Venezuelan case, there was a negotiation in 2019, and we did not back it. Candidly, we didn't back it because my friend and colleague John Bolton was against it. I thought we should back it, so there was a kind of standoff, and the US was essentially silent and inactive on the question, and we did not certainly back the negotiations. But the opposition wanted them. So I think that was a mistake. There were negotiations last year where I think we did more. They did not succeed. They did not go anywhere. But it seems to me, as a general point, it's their country, not ours. However well we understand it, they understand it better. And if the Democratic opposition, in a pretty unified way, wants negotiations, we should back them. I would say that's true of Nicaragua today, too, where the situation of the political leadership, opposition, Democratic political leadership in prison is quite dire. And in many cases, they and their families want some kind of negotiation with the regime. I think if they do, we should not try to prevent that. Last point, something to think about in pretty much every case, threats of military action. We made them in Venezuela. Remember, all options are on the table. And I mean, that statement had the virtue of being true, which is the way I defended it at the time. That is, all options are always available to the president of the United States. If the president wanted to use the military in some way in Venezuela, he could have. The problem is that I think one can see now that that weakened the opposition. It did so partly because some portion of the public and some portion of the opposition thought there would now be a Deus Ex Machina ending. Why do I have to risk my life and maybe get shot, tortured, imprisoned when the Marines may be coming? So that's a real danger, I think, pardon me, when you make that threat. The other threat is, of course, what if you're bluffing? And, you know, that's a general rule. The president of the United States should never bluff and should never say all options are on the table if, in fact, there is no realistic prospect of using military force. I understand the argument on the other side. What do you do then? Do you say, forget it, we are absolutely not using military force, which is, in a sense, what the president has said in the Ukraine case, barring, I guess, attacks on Americans in Ukraine. But I think we should be probably more careful than we were in the threat or implicit threat of military action in Venezuela. There are a few more points I could make, but I think, Chuck, let me stop there and turn it back to you.
Thanks, Elliott. I really appreciated that thorough discussion based, of course, on your experience. I wanted to do something I probably should have done at the beginning, which is mention the elephant in the room, which is the crisis in Europe right now, which is about democracy promotion, but it's also in the sense that probably a major reason Putin is threatening Ukraine is that it's attempting to become democratic in what he considers traditional Russian sphere. But it's also about geopolitics, which is kind of my sort of response, which will turn into a question for you. As I listened to you sort of drill down into a very specific case study, I found myself thinking about how these situations vary according to the global geopolitical situation. And of course, when you were talking about the Reagan administration effort to oust somebody like Baby Doc or some other right-wing dictators, that's a situation in which we're kind of cleaning up our own camp, making our own democratic sphere more consistent, so to speak, as opposed to a situation like Cuba or Venezuela or even Nicaragua back in the late 80s and early 90s, where where our goal is to democratize a country that is allied with the other camp, so to speak, in geopolitics. So that's kind of one historical note about how the task of regime change or democracy promotion in a very stubborn case varies according to the geopolitical circumstances. But also when you allude to the fact that Venezuela proved unchangeable in part because of the outside support, I mean, I think it's not just outside support, it was the outside support, and I'm sure you're aware of this, in the hard power areas of the regime, the intelligence, the security, the facilitation of sanctions, busting, and so on. And raises the question of whether the general balance of power that China and Russia are attempting to shift to their advantage, and to some extent, let's face it, have succeeded in shifting to their advantage, doesn't change everything. about the prospects for democracy promotion. Putin has specifically targeted color revolutions, as he calls them, of the kind we were trying to engineer in Venezuela, basically. And China has, in their recent joint statement, has endorsed that denunciation of color revolutions. So perhaps you could react a little bit to that question of the geopolitical circumstances as the key variable, if it is.
Well, first, look, a phrase I've used for a long time and like to use, a government is not an NGO. And while human rights groups have the ability, and human rights groups should not be doing this balancing of economic and security and, other interests. They should be promoting human rights, period. No government can do that. So I certainly recognize that these situations vary when there is a, let's say, big power component to it. And there will be places where we're going to tone down our democracy promotion. But I go back to the Reagan days. I mean, there was a big power element back then as well, as we all remember or recognize. And yet that did not prevent us from having a pretty robust ideological program. And that's what we're talking about here in a sense. I mean, Ukraine is a very good example of this because, I have heard in the last few weeks, not only the argument that, only China matters, Ukraine doesn't matter, Europe doesn't matter, NATO doesn't matter, but a very old argument about we have to understand Russian insecurity, west of the Urals, there are no physical boundaries and it's Russian insecurity. I mean, I never thought I'd hear this garbage again, but it's Russian insecurity. And you see, since they don't have mountains, what they need, they need a group of states that provide them security. This is called the Soviet Empire. And it is interesting to note, I think, that there's no physical threat to Putin from Ukraine. And if all he wanted was a guarantee, for example, that NATO we weren't going to put missiles in Ukraine, he could have, I think, had that pretty easily. It's the ideological danger of Ukraine, I think, that is so great to Putin, not to Russia, to Putin. Well, we can't agree to that. I mean, it would be unbelievable for the United States to agree to the expansion of not only dictatorships, but dictatorships imposed from outside. The ideological element, I think, reminds us that this is not what Paul Warnke once called apes on a treadmill. This is about freedom and about the forces that are opposed to the expansion of freedom. This is about letting populations that want freedom have it. So, I think we should be pretty robust in these cases. And, again, limited. I mean, I think one can make a very good argument that Tibet should be free. But when you weigh all of the circumstances, it is very hard to make the argument that that should be a top priority for American foreign policy. But more generally, I take the view that in what is looking like a very tough contest with Russia and China over the next, 50 years, we would be crazy to deprive ourselves of one of our greatest assets, which is the ideological asset, freedom.
I certainly agree with you on that point. I think as an historical question, I wonder, again, as we think somewhat abstractly and somewhat concretely about democracy promotion as such, in other words, taking places that aren't already democracy and helping them become one, whether there isn't a sort of irreducible element, ironically, of force involved in that. The most durable democracies in the post-war world are those in which the United States intervened pretty overwhelmingly and directly to kind of make them that way. I'm thinking about Western Europe, Korea, Japan. And those are, and of course, their alliances with us include, in effect, a kind of political condition on the alliance. You have to be a democracy. That's being tested now in the case of a country like Hungary, perhaps. But in a way, what I heard in the Venezuela example was a situation which it may just be the fact that if you forswear military intervention, you kind of, and the other side has both the intention and the capability of using its hard power aggressively to prevent democracy, maybe kind of a hopeless situation.
Well, I think your last point is a critical one. That is, I am not in favor of going around invading countries to democratize them. And I would argue that we've almost never done that. Maybe you could say we did it in Panama and Grenada to some degree.
Well, I have to break in and mention Iraq in that context, but go ahead.
Yeah, but I don't, I didn't mention Iraq because I don't think it's true. That is, I don't think that absent the nuclear question, we would have gone into Iraq. What do you do? The question you're raising, what do you do if the other side is willing to act? And my answer to that would be, you have to meet, if you will, force with force. Now, in the case in some cases, it's not really the outside intervention that's critical. Nicaragua today, I think, it's the brutality of the regime. In the case of Venezuela, it was coming from outside. And the other question was, well, what can we do? And we did kind of forswear old-fashioned covert action. One could have imagined, we know that the regime in Venezuela, for example, was helping the FARC in Colombia and harboring the FARC. One could have thought about some greater military presence, for example, in Colombia, on the Colombian border. And one could have thought again about covert action, which we did not do. I would do that. I mean, I only do it when, we are convinced it's smart and we know what we're doing, but I would certainly not forswear it, because it seems to me if we do, it's just an open invitation to Cuba, whose intelligence services are very good, nowadays to the Russians, to see if they can include any more spaces in this hemisphere, but beyond this hemisphere as well. What do we do if the Iranians decide to take Bahrain? Not invading, but decide that it's time to overthrow the king. Well, I would hope we would respond to that, and pretty forcefully.
I just unmuted it, sorry. Well, I think we have some time now for questions. It's 12:30. And our first question is from Jennifer Walters, if she's with us.
Hi, Mr. Lane, I'm right here.
Great.
Hello, everyone.
Fantastic. You're outdoors on maneuvers, it looks like.
I know. I'm really living up to this uniform. No, hopefully there's not too much ambient noise. I'm actually in the courtyard of the Pentagon.
You sound clear. You sound good. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. I just want to thank very briefly Sydney Lipset for inviting me. I was really looking forward to this, and I'm glad I could attend. And then Mr. Abrams, thank you for your comments. So I was reading through some of your work recently in anticipation of this, and I got very clearly the message that you've cultivated throughout your career of, as we develop democracies in other countries, it kind of has to be democracy first, and then the human rights development kind of has to follow. There does need to be a specificity of how those things happen if they're going to lead to enduring change. And then the things that you mentioned about Venezuela in particular, just, you said you had 20 reasons, but you kind of went through the ones that stuck out to me that could have made perhaps that democracy promotion more successful, the detailed plans, the IMF loans, State and Treasury Department that never went public, those very granular plans, amnesty for the regime leaders, and even negotiations. You mentioned military generals giving them some level of assurance. All these things that could have helped that take root. And as I mentioned, as I was reading your work, it kept occurring to me, like, there's this implementation framework, the democratic transition framework that you've talked about a lot. Is there something almost like something that would pair with that, like a diagnostic framework? Like, which countries or which societies have you noticed in your career and experience? Are there certain characteristics that make them more likely for a framework such as the democratic transition framework to take hold?
Thank you. Well, I would accept Chuck's statement that, if we're trying to analyze this, yeah, if you've been invaded and occupied by the United States, that's first. That, the record is not bad, including Iraq, which, has had 5 consecutive pretty good elections, and where I'd say the greatest hurdle to further democratization is Iran and the Shia militias. Okay, that's one, but that's going to be reasonably rare. There's been a fair amount of social science work on this. I'm not a social scientist, and I haven't done it. I mean, Tom Carruthers, who's on this, has done some of it, about what to look for. One can mention a few things. I don't have a set scheme. It's better to have been a British colony than anything else. French, Dutch, Belgian, a certain degree of prosperity. Probably the critical thing, I see Peter Ackerman is there too, is an opposition movement. There's no substitute for that. What we're really trying to do in all these cases, in everyone I've mentioned, is support a genuine opposition movement, a democratic movement inside the country. We're not inventing it, and we're not imposing it. We're supporting it. So, if you're looking at countries, that's something to look for. Does it exist? How strong is it? And then, we're trying to figure out, well, what might we be able to do to help, either by helping directly or by preventing help to the regime, which is to suppress that. But I did want to come back just for a minute on what you said at the beginning. That's sequentialism, in a sense. I'm not big on sequentialism. Sequentialism basically says, postpone the elections until the end, when the fundamental human rights have been established. I'm not in favor of it, partly because when the people of the country are demanding elections, it's really hard, I think, for Americans to be in the position of saying, no free election. Sometimes it is wise to postpone it, but if they really want it, it's hard. Secondly, we're talking about transition here from a dictatorial regime, an authoritarian regime. How are you going to get all that human rights progress while that regime is in power? I mean, you may need to get that election to mark the point at which the regime leaves power. And then you try to increase the amount of respect for human rights, which is unlikely to go from 0 to 100 overnight. But I'm dubious about sequentialism and delaying elections. I think elections are absolutely critical in the transition.
Major, did you want to follow up with anything?
No, I mean, I appreciate that answer, and it's very that makes a lot of sense to me, and it's clarifying about the sequentialism. Maybe I misinterpreted that, but the way that you laid that out, Mr. Abrams, it makes a lot of sense. And
Thank you.
Obviously, my background is pretty clear with my outfit here, and I think that military officers should be as informed as possible about foreign policy, because if you don't know what's going on there, then how are you going to interact with and implement national security? So thanks again for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Major Walters. We are open for business on the chat. I'm looking for questions here. And I suppose I don't see any hands raised. Have people raised their hands? Okay, I have one question I wanted to go to that's been in for a while. And it comes, I have to scroll down just a moment. It comes from, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Mohammed Nosair. And the question, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, is the United States often doing its best to promote democracy or using this proposition as a political pressure tactic? So I take, I'm going to put a little spin on that question and maybe recast it for you, Elliott. Are we always sincere, or are we just trying to lean on, are we kind of using the democracy promotion card for more straightforward kind of geopolitical or other national interest advantage? And if I misinterpreted that question, I hope Mr. Nosair will speak up, but I think I got the gist.
You know, tell me which government is always sincere. I mean,
sincere was my word,
okay.
not his, to be sure.
Sure. I mean, we had this discussion in 1981 in the Reagan administration. That is, if all you had was an anti-Soviet policy, which condemned all of the Soviet allies for their lack of democracy and their human rights violations, but you were silent about, you know, Pinochet and Stroessner and Duvalier and Marcos and Chandu Huan because they were in our camp. You're not for democracy or human rights. I mean, you just have an anti-Soviet policy, which is a good thing, but it's not a human rights policy. Okay, I see the note from Mr. Nosair that you got the question correctly. And I think it's very important to avoid that. And it is important, I think, if I can put it this way, though it may seem imperialistic, colonialistic, and condescending, you got to police up your own side. As you said, Chuck, we were doing in some of those Latin American cases. Remember, you know, when there was a point at which NATO had Portugal and Spain in it under Salazar and Franco. So we had to help them so that NATO became an alliance of free or democratic countries. And what do we do now about a place, what do we do about the monarchies, for example, which in Arab lands are not, though they vary in the degree of repression, they're obviously not democracies. I think it's very important to keep the pressure on. I was critical of Obama's Egypt policy and Trump's, and I'm critical now of Biden's, because I think we're not doing that. I think we're much too willing to allow Sisi to be far more repressive than Mubarak was. I think that's a good example, and I think we should not be doing that. But there's no question that at times, one of the sticks with which we beat a government we don't like is the fact that it is a repressive government, and we lighten up too much on repressive governments that, you know, are on our side of the divide with the, let's say, the Russians and Chinese.
So we have a couple of hands up. I'm going to go to Ron Radosh first. Ron? Ron, I can see you're muted. So if you can fix that, we'll hear your question. You're still muted, Ron.
I can see you, but you're muted.
Well, we'll let Ron work on the technology and go to Peter Ackerman.
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Elliott, hi, and thanks for the presentation. As some of you know, I founded an organization called the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. The premise of the center was that skills in civil resistance are the most important determinant in creating democracy. The power of the dissident, the pro-democracy activist in undermining the legitimacy of the other side through strikes, boycotts, mass protests are by far more powerful than what outsiders can do. We commissioned a study, which I'm glad to share with people, that basically looked at 80 cases of civil resistance in this century and asked the simple questions: what kind of outside assistance was the most important? And it was broken down into 4 categories. The first were sanctions by government. The second was naming and shaming by international human rights organizations. The third was asset transfers, like we saw the labor unions do with the Poles in 1980. And then the fourth was knowledge transfer about civil resistance and how to build skills. And each of the first 3 were slightly positive, but there were negatives involved and blowback involved. But the unquestionably the most positive thing that one could do if you want to promote democracy by empowering dissidents was the transfer of knowledge. We've been in the business now for 20 years of having workshops with dissidents now in 117 countries. And we are perfecting how that transfer of knowledge occurs. But if anybody here wants to see the paper, just let the American Purpose people know, and I'll be glad to send it to you.
Thank you, Peter. Any response, Elliott? That's a useful dose of empirical data.
Yeah, I mean, Peter's done and the organization done important work here, and I agree with it. I think we underestimate sometimes the incredible difficulty under which the people are working in those movements. I mean, I got really tired, for example, of hearing the criticisms of the Venezuelan opposition because they hadn't done this and they hadn't done that. You know, and I think of Navalny and I think of Nemtsov. They didn't overthrow Putin, so what did they achieve? You know, it's a cheap criticism of people who are risking their lives trying to organize a movement that has had its ups and downs in each of these countries. In each of these countries, you know, there have been some massive demonstrations in Cuba, in Nicaragua, to take the ones we've been talking about, Egypt, obviously, which is what ultimately overthrew Mubarak. Yet, in all those cases, they have not been able to move the country to democracy. In Egypt, it worked briefly and failed again. But I thank you for the intervention, Peter.
Ron Radosh seems to have
Yes.
cured his silence, and he
Right.
has got a question.
Yeah, thanks. Ellie, thanks for your excellent presentation. I do have a question, or comment and question. One thing we don't face now that we had at the time, the heyday of the Latin American left in the 60s and 70s, you don't have this big pro-left, pro-Cuba, pro-Nicaragua movement in the United States opposed to American foreign policy. And yet, so many decades, what John Bolton called the axis of evil in this hemisphere, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, nothing has budged them. There has been no successful attempt to turn back to democracy. And as you just mentioned, despite the very impressive July, was it 2020, demonstrations within Cuba, they haven't moved anything. It's great. It produces great despair and the inability to stop countries like Cuba from beginning to change. The repression of the state apparatus is so great that it almost seems hopeless at times. And I think just yesterday we read in the papers about the death in Nicaragua of Hugo Torres, who was among the Sandinistas who stormed the national legislature and freed Daniel Ortega at the beginning of the Nicaraguan Revolution in '79. And he died in prison under suspicious circumstances because they successfully imprisoned all the opposition, including all their old comrades from the Nicaraguan Revolution. And yet, it's so blatant, nothing has happened. I am very depressed about that. I wonder what your thoughts are, Elliott, about the inability of movement forwards towards democracy in these countries in our hemisphere.
I'm going to, before you answer that, Elliott, I'm going to exercise the privilege of the chair to do something that I hope will make the meeting somewhat more compact, because we have about 14 minutes left. I see two other hands up, Eric Hontz and Michael Indra. And what I'd like to ask is for each of them to pose their questions to you, and then do so succinctly, and then Elliott can answer all three, including Ron's, when he's done. Gentlemen.
Sure, thanks. Thanks for the opportunity. So when I think about democracy promotion or democracy support, to my mind, I separate it in two eras, and one is pre-Soviet collapse and one is post-Soviet collapse. And what we see since 1991 in the difference is an IT revolution and a financial revolution, a globalization revolution, where you can move money at the click of a mouse anywhere around the world. So when I work in a market like Ukraine, where there is robust support for democracy, I have to contend with a number of oligarchs who are not so committed to democracy and committed to the status quo and committed to rent seeking that prevents the real establishment of a middle class that would advocate for further rights, further rule of law issues, and that would support local civil society without the intervention and the support of the EU and the United States. So how would you deal with this issue of a local captured class or class that has captured the economy and then can stash assets in the West and continue to fund themselves in the status quo and stall democracy at this point in time? And then the second question might be related to this somewhat, is how to deal with these new two large neo-mercantilist powers of China and Russia, where they use a private sector as economic coercion to smaller states and even large states in the case of Australia. Thank you.
So Michael?
Yes, this is a bit of a follow-up to Major Walter's question and your response to that. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I focus more on the cultural underpinnings of democracy, which you referred to in your response, whether it was a British colony or a French colony or whatever. Given that the underlying problems with putting institutions in other countries, democracy, are you a pessimist or an optimist? Our interventions and our attempts haven't gone very well sometimes, because I think, like in the Middle East, there's just not a culture there of opposition. This gets into anthropological stuff, tribal segmentation issues. Other people have written about that. So just given some of these cultural differences, are you a pessimist or an optimist on democratization?
Okay, I mean, each of those questions deserves roughly an hour. But, to Ron Radosh, I understand the reason to be depressed. And yet, we are not doing anything like what we could be doing. And here's an example. When I say we, I mean the United States. And here's an example. We don't have an Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights. That doesn't change the world. But it's an important role in the State Department. And there's what I would consider a good nominee, Sarah Morgan, and she can't get by the Republicans on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And it's bad for our human rights policy that job is vacant. It's tough enough when there's a good person in the job within the State Department bureaucracy to try to promote the human rights issues and get them up on the agenda. When there is no person in that job, it's that much tougher. You mentioned Hugo Torres. That's right. I mean, did the United States call for a special OAS Human Rights Commission session or a UN Human Rights Commission session? Do we do anything? I don't think we did anything. So we could be doing a good deal more. The other reason, and we get partly to Michael's question, but I mean, Am I optimistic? I mean, we've seen an awful lot of dictatorships fall. Dictatorships that were more powerful than some of the ones we've been speaking about. And that, leads me to think that there will come moments. I mean, here's an example. Daniel Ortega is sick. When Daniel Ortega dies and his, I'm going to avoid adjectives, wife takes over, is she going to have the support? For example, is the army going to support her? Should we be saying to the Nicaraguan army today, this would be a covert activity? You don't want to live under her control. She's nuts. Is that a moment when change comes? How about when Raul dies in Cuba? Is that a moment when change comes? I mean, there are artificial moments that one can create, and there are moments that will appear if you will, in real life anyway, that make me a little bit more optimistic. We could do more, to getting to Eric's question. We could sure do more. I mean, I think in most of those cases, people, the oligarchs, utilize the global or Western financial system, and a lot, which is why, for one thing, Magnitsky sanctions are a good idea. This drove me nuts in the case of Venezuela, because the EU wouldn't really do anything much about assets of Venezuelans for a very long time. But, Russian oligarchs, I mean, one can do, I believe there are actual oligarchy tours, architectural tours of London. You can take you to see his mansion, and then his mansion, and then his mansion. We don't have to put up with that. One of the sanctions that talked about, if Putin does decide to invade Ukraine, is financial sanctions in London that would drive the Russians out of that system. Well, that will be useful in this case, but it would have been useful yesterday too. So to me, the question is, what can we do in the West to prevent it? I think the description of their using illegally or semi-legally captured funds to keep themselves in power, to keep the system in power, is right. But the least we can do, and haven't done, is to make it harder for them, and to make sure that they cannot do transactions with Western institutions. And, how do we get Russia and China? I think what we can do in those, this is Michael's second question. I'm sorry, Eric's second question. The Australians resisted. Lithuania is resisting. There are things that can be done by them or by us, or by the EU, for example, that can greatly strengthen Lithuania's ability to resist. It's also the case that some of this manipulation by China has now produced a counter reaction, because people have seen what happened in Sri Lanka, for example. They've seen cases of where China ends up owning national assets. And I think people are a little more reluctant to do that now. Governments are. We, of course, through DFC and other mechanisms, can try to provide, we're just beginning to do this, we're not where we ought to be, try to provide alternatives so that we can go to the government and say, you don't have to do that deal with China. We can arrange some financing that's much fairer to you. In other words, we got to play the game if they're going to play that game. Am I an optimist? I am an optimist. I'm not suggesting that I think that it is inevitable that every country every country sort of read the Federalist Papers and adopt that system. There are days, of course, when it seems that the notion that we would be exporting this system is crazy given its occasional dysfunctionality. But we're not. What we're trying to do is to look at things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which scores of countries have signed. That's what we're in favor of. And as Condi Rice used to say, democracy never has to be imposed, dictatorship has to be imposed. I think you see in country after country a real movement, indigenous movement against these corrupt and vicious and brutal regimes. We're not imposing anything. The question is whether we can usefully support people who are trying to replace those regimes with popular sovereignty. And I am optimistic about that because I think various forms of popular sovereignty, our kind of democracy, parliamentary democracy, monarchy, are consistent with real elements of popular sovereignty and respect for human rights. I think there are very few cultures in which, well, again, I'm going to quote Condi, but as she used to say, where are the cultures in which people want and approve of the idea that the secret police will come and knock on your door at midnight and take your son away?
Well, Elliott, we're bumping up against our hard stop at 1 p.m. and I want to squeeze in a real good question from Bill Wanland, who's been patiently waiting. He asked, reports by Freedom House and other organizations suggest that American democracy has been eroding. Is there reason to believe the US can still be regarded as a democratic role model? I think that's another one of the elephants in the room, and I'll give you 2 minutes to deal with that very difficult question before we all have to go. And before we do go, I want to thank you and everybody else on this call for a terrific discussion.
Well, let me start by thanking you, Chuck, thanking Jeff for inviting me, thanking Michelle and Sydney for helping arrange this, and all of you who were there on the screen. First, I have never come across, I think ask the opposition, ask the Democrats in the 100 countries we're talking about. I have not, in 40 years of doing this, heard many examples of where Democratic opposition leaders said, go away. I mean, we heard this really, frankly, under Obama in Iran, that it would hurt the anti-regime elements if he supported them. We didn't hear that from them. We heard it from the administration. So I don't think we've reached anything like that point. And I think there are many ways of seeing that the United States still stands in the eyes of people around the world for liberty. Are we eroding as a role model? We are eroding as a role model to the extent that our government doesn't govern effectively. It is true that I realize I got 1 minute left. It is true that people appreciate governments like that in the UAE or Singapore because they're thought to govern effectively and efficiently, though not democratically. And it's true that in our system, if you look at the paralysis on Capitol Hill on many things, the government is not working as effectively as it should. Infrastructure, we're 30 years behind. But I think people, personally, greatly overdo the sense that the United States as a working democracy no longer works. And therefore, we're not in a position to criticize the vicious, brutal, corrupt governments in places like Russia and China.
Well, Elliott, one of the many things I appreciate about you is that you're punctual. You got us in right under the 1 p.m. wire. Again, my thanks to you and the American Purpose for a great meeting, and thanks for the good questions from our Zoom meeting audience. I'm sure all of you noticed along the right-hand side of this meeting, there were a lot of good article suggestions. I encourage everyone to follow up. Thank you very much.
Thank you
so much.